Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's program, How to Create a Useful Program Survey, hosted by the Laconia Programs Outreach and Promotions Group. My name is Caitlin, and I'm a librarian at the Northbrook Public Library. And before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this program is being recorded and will be shared with the attendees afterwards. There will also be time for Q&A with our presenters at the end of the program, so if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A box down below. And now I would like to introduce today's speakers. Rebecca Teasdale is an assistant professor of educational psychology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. As an evaluation methodologist at UIC, she develops methods and tools to help libraries and other organizations evaluate their programs and services, and teaches graduate level courses in evaluation and research methods. Previously, Rebecca spent more than 15 years as a public librarian and public library administrator. She was a founding member of the Project Outcome Task Force and has served as an instructor for the Research Institute for Public Libraries since 2015. She also directs Embedding Evaluation in Libraries, a team-based training and coaching program for public library staff. Mallory Edgar is a consultant and co-founder of Fifth Star Collective, a consulting partnership providing data, evaluation, and strategic planning services. She has more than a decade of experience in nonprofit and academic settings in the public health field, with previous work including direct service, mixed methods research, program planning, evaluation, and management. Since 2019, she has also been involved in the public library world, providing data analytics support to the Oak Park Public Library and the statewide collaborative Illinois Libraries Present. And now I would like to hand it over to Rebecca and Mallory to begin today's presentation.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. My name's Rebecca Teasdale. I'm so happy to be here. As I was listening to Caitlin read the introduction, I thought, I need to start with, first and foremost, I'm a librarian. And so it's really great to be with all of you and to be back in Laconia space. Really excited to be here today and talk about all things surveys with Mallory. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Mallory to get us started.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. So now that you've heard a little bit about who Rebecca and I are, we wanted to give you a quick overview of what you can expect out of the webinar today. So when Rebecca and I were, I skipped over the introduction since we've done those already. Rebecca and I, when we met to start talking about what kind of content we would want to put in a webinar that was focused on how you do a really good program survey, we decided we wanted to approach it thinking about the whole sort of life cycle of a survey, from designing it all the way through sharing what you learn. And so you can see that reflected in the outline that's shared on the slide that's on your screen right now. There's kind of 5 key things, tips, steps to consider that we're going to go through. And those are: first, think about your why. Secondly, design quality survey items. Develop a thoughtful plan for administration, analyze your data with care, and then share what you learn. So we're going to go through each of those 5 pieces in order. Rebecca and I will kind of bounce back and forth going through content. And then at the end, we'll have some resources that we can share with all of you, and then some time for questions at the very end. So I'm going to get us started off with that first item. Think about your why. So you're at this place where you're like, hey, I want to get some feedback about my programs, about outreach, whatever the case may be. And I think I want to do a survey. So before you jump into thinking about what are the questions that I'm going to ask and how am I going to share that, you want to take some time at the beginning to really consider what's your ultimate goal in doing a survey. So we've probably all heard this piece of advice before, and it holds true with survey data collection, with other types of data collection as well. Begin with the end in mind. So like I said, before you start investing your time and your resources in crafting the survey, administering it, analyzing the results, you want to get clear about what you're driving toward. And by taking some time to do that up front, that's also going to help you get a better idea of what types of questions you want to ask, who you want to ask those questions of, and importantly, if a survey is the best tool for the information that you're wanting and needing to get. So we listed some questions on the slide right here that you can ask yourself in these early phases. So what are you hoping to, to understand or learn more about? So do you just want to know how satisfied program participants are with their experience, or are you wanting to go deeper and find out, maybe if they felt like they learned something, if they felt like they had a chance to practice a skill, what they thought went really well in the program, if they have ideas about future programming as well. Or maybe are you wanting to hear from people who haven't attended programs at your library before to find out what might be stopping them from participating in that service? Relatedly, that next question on the slide, why is this information important to you, your team, or your library? And I bring this up just as a plug to think about, what is your ultimate goal in offering programs or services, whatever it is that you're going to be asking questions about in this survey? What's the impact that you're hoping to have on the community by offering those resources? What are you hoping that they get out of it? Because if you have a sense of what some of those outcomes are that you're hoping to see from your work, that can help you think about, what sort of questions you may want to ask. So if part of your goal in offering programs is to help people learn something new, you want to ask in your survey whether or not they felt like they learned something new, right? So that you can speak to that. And for this question, when you're thinking about the importance, I would just put a plug for if your library has something like a strategic plan, or if your team within the library has like a logic model or some sort of goal-oriented document, that can be a nice thing for you to consult to see like what are some of the things we were thinking of in terms of impact and outcomes when we were first thinking about doing programming or outreach. And then that last question, how do you envision using what you learned? So we'll talk more about this later, but of course you want to make sure that if you're collecting the data that you're actually going to be using it. You may end up using the data in ways that you didn't envision at the beginning, but you should start off having at least an initial idea of how you think you'll use the information you learn, whether that's to improve program offerings, improve like your promotions or communications around programs, or maybe to encourage more community members to attend programming, especially if they haven't before in the past, or maybe it's something else entirely. But as you're thinking about those questions that we talked about on the last slide, your answers are also going to help you get a sense of whether or not a survey is the best tool, like I mentioned before. So I think that when we're thinking about getting feedback from people, surveys are often the very first thing that comes to mind for us. And it makes a lot of sense. There's good reason why surveys come to mind. There are a lot of benefits. I listed some of those up on the slide, and I'm sure that's not an exhaustive list either, but they're a familiar tool. So everybody on this webinar, I'm sure, has filled out at least one survey in their lifetime, probably made some surveys before too. So it's a really known quantity for people. They're flexible in that you can distribute them and administer them in a lot of different ways, which we'll talk more about later. They're also pretty cost effective. So compared to other data collection methods, it's a pretty low cost option, especially if you're using online methods to share it. They're also pretty low burden for respondents. So, it's something that they can complete at a time that works well for them. They don't have to be at a certain place at a certain time to give their feedback as they would with something like, an interview or a focus group. And if you keep the survey short and mostly close-ended, which Rebecca will talk about a little bit more later, they shouldn't take that much time for a respondent to complete. And then lastly, in terms of privacy, surveys also offer this level of anonymity that a lot of respondents maybe prefer. Maybe it feels like they could be a little bit more honest with the answers that they're giving if they know that their name's not attached to it. So lots of really great benefits to using a survey, but it's really important to remember that surveys aren't your only option for data collection, and they may not be the best option for your purposes. So something like an interview or a focus group, that might be a better fit if you are wanting to get kind of more in-depth information, if you're asking about topics that are a little bit more complicated and you want to be able to ask follow-up questions and dig a little deeper with folks. Using something like an interview or focus group is going to probably be more beneficial than a survey. Of course, the trade-off if you are using one of those methods is, of course, that there's going to be more time that's required for both you and the respondents, and more resources, especially if you're thinking about doing things like, providing food at a focus group or transportation assistance or incentives like gift cards or something like that for participation. Another method that might be of interest if you're wanting to learn more about like process related elements of your program or event, like what went really well, where were there hiccups, would be something like observational. And so that would be a case where a staff member would be at the program or event, and they wouldn't be facilitating it. They'd purely be there just to observe what's happening, take note about how things are going, so that then afterwards you could all come together and talk about like what things went smoothly, what things were a little bit more challenging. So those are just examples of some other methods that you could consider. But if once you've weighed your options, you're like, survey is the thing, then it's time to get into the details and think about designing it. So Rebecca's going to talk more about designing quality survey items.
Sorry, I have so many screens that getting my unmute is a bit of a journey on my computer. Great. So as Mallory was talking about, once you decide that you're doing a survey, you're doing it for a purpose, right? And so we want to be sure that the data that we're giving us are going to really inform the kind of decisions that we want to make. We want to make sure that we're getting high quality data that can help us make really good decisions. And so all of that rests on the quality of the survey items themselves. So in thinking about writing a survey, I know a lot of us have experience writing surveys. And as we start to get into the nitty gritty, it quickly becomes clear that they can be a little more complicated than it appears at the first glance. And that's because the wording really matters. So the wording of survey items in terms of the question or statement that we're presenting to people and the response options that we're giving them makes a big difference in the kind of data that we get out of our survey at the end. So as we're preparing our survey, what we're really trying to do is to create items that are going to be really clear to the person taking the survey, that are going to be easy for them to answer, that aren't going to lead them in one direction or another, and are going to be understood the same by all the different people that take the survey. Now, we may not exactly get there. There's always going to be some variation among all the different people taking the survey, for example, but this is what we're going to be striving for. And so to do that, we have a few tips for you to keep in mind. And what I'm going to do is go through these and kind of share these tips, and then we're going to show you some examples of what this looks like. So in writing surveys, we want to be sure that we're using really simple, clear, everyday language. And that means avoiding jargon and avoiding acronyms. And in libraries, we have so much jargon. We have so many acronyms that sometimes we don't even see them ourselves anymore. So that's a really important thing to pay attention to. We also want to be sure that each item in our survey is focused on just one idea, so that the person taking the survey, the respondent, is really clear what information we're seeking. We also want to make sure that in the response options that we provide, that there is an answer choice for everyone. So every person who takes the survey needs to be able to see themselves in the responses that are available. We also want to make sure that the answer choices are distinct, so that each response choice is distinguishable and different from the others. And then, as I mentioned before, we want to be really careful about leading language. So sometimes the easiest way to see these tips and principles in action is to look at some terrible survey items and kind of see what happens when we don't follow these tips. So I've got 5 survey items here, and what I want you to do is to go ahead and use the chat and take a look at this first item and see if you can identify a flaw in this item. If you were taking this survey as a member of the public, survey item says, how did you learn about today's program? And then we've got 4 choices: the library website, a flyer in the library, friend or family, library staff member. If you were going to critique this, what would you say? Oh, this is awesome. I see them coming in the chat. Great. So we've got a couple of people saying that there's lots of other options that aren't listed. There's not a choice for everyone, right? Can you select all that apply, right? Some overlap here, right? What if your friend works at the library? What if your family member works at the library? Exactly. So actually you found more flaws than I did, and appreciate that. So the main flaw we wanted to illustrate here was limited response choices. We want to make sure that we're providing a response choice for everyone. And so one of the ways we can fix this is actually some suggestions that you all had in the chat, which is, first of all, to provide more options, to think about more places someone may have heard about today's program. And then to also allow people to check more than one, or, often we hear about things in multiple ways, right? So they can actually indicate, well, first I saw it on the website and then my friend recommended it as well. And we've also fixed this item by adding that other, please specify. So having an opportunity for people to express something that we didn't even think of and make sure that that's included in our data as well. All right, that was great. Let's do it again. So our second flawed item asks to please rate the stories and activities in today's story times. And we have a scale here from not engaging to very engaging. What flaw do you see in this item? You can go ahead again and pop it in the chat. Okay, so we've got a few things in here. So there's a couple things. So the question about how many points should be in this rating scale, I'm going to set aside for the Q&A, because that's a great question, whether or not there should be a neutral in here. But this is what we refer to as a double-barreled item. So we have two things we're asking about. We're asking about stories and we're asking about activities. And so the problem is that if someone comes to story time and they thought that the stories were super engaging and amazing, but they thought the activities were not, which answer are they supposed to give? And so this is this idea of people, you want everyone who takes the survey to see, kind of interpret the same thing. You're going to have some people rating stories, you're going to have some people rating activities. And so what we want to do to fix that is to include just one idea in every story time. Now, there was also some great feedback in here about the idea of engaging and engaging for whom. Which exactly, you're getting the idea here. We got to think about who's responding to this and how are they interpreting these items. And we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about how we can do that. All right, let's do it again. Question number 3, how old is your child? And we have some options here, 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and over 15. What flaw do you see here? Yes. Okay. So we've got a couple, at least. Maybe there's more that you all will spot that we missed. So the first is that we have overlapping response choices. So if you have a 10-year-old, which box do you check, right? And this seems so obvious when we look at this, right? And I can't tell you how many times I've done this in practice where I really thought that my options were distinct. And then I share it with someone, share it with Mallory, a colleague who works in this space, and they're able to point out those overlapping response choices. So making sure each item is distinct is really important. We also have an issue here about the clarity of the language, right? So people have multiple kids. I saw that come through in the chat. Sometimes they even have multiple children with them in the program that we're talking about. So being really specific about which child, which program, which visit the item addresses. So in this case, I'm contradicting myself. I just assumed that they had one child in this program, but we would ask, how old is the child who participated in today's program? And then we fixed those age ranges. There's some comments in the chat about how broad you want those ranges to be. And that's going to depend on how you're using these data, right? If you need to disaggregate it at a more granular level, or if you're going to be looking at those larger groups. All right, let's try another one. Number 4, which of the following library services has your family used in the past year? Check all that apply. And we have adult services, we have children's services, we have CERC, library catalog, technology, none of the above. So what stands out to you here in this item? What would you see as a flaw or multiple flaws? Okay, we've got a few, right? So first of all, we've got some jargon. What is circulation? What's the library catalog, right? We also had some overlap there in terms of, what is the different, all the things that make up adult services. We've got the library catalog, which is part of technology, which was just said. It's also really difficult to answer. it's hard for me to think about everything I've done in the past year, right? And come up with how I'm going to respond to this item. And it's really hard for me to be able to answer on behalf of my entire family. So I may not know what my partner or my, if I have adult children or different people that visit independently, to know what they did at the library. So we want to focus instead on to make it more answerable, shorter periods of time, and focusing on an individual's personal direct experience. And then we also change this item up to list specific actions and activities that the individual may have done, hopefully in language that's a little more accessible. Now, one of the comments that was in the chat was about that the library does a lot of other things, like there's a lot missing here. And that is definitely true. So often when we're writing survey items, we're not going to include everything that we do. We're only going to be focusing in on some very specific things to answer those questions that we have, those decisions that we're trying to make. So that's something to keep in mind as well, is like, how many things are you actually trying to find out based on the decisions that you're going to make down the road? Okay, I've got one more. Item number 5. Overall, was the service you received during today's library visit excellent? Yes or no? So what do we think about this one? I know I have been in many stores recently where at the end of my receipt, I get this thing printed out and it says like, please give me make sure you give me 5 stars and I'll get a free lunch kind of thing. And as people are saying, yes, that is a leading question. So what we want to do is provide space in our items for people to provide positive or negative feedback, not to push them in one direction or another. Another issue we have here is that we've got a really limited response choice, right? Like it's yes or no. And so if I'm thinking about this, like, well, like it was kind of excellent, like, I don't know, it doesn't give me a lot of room again to find a choice that matches for me. So this would be an opportunity where we might want to use a rating scale. So here we're asking them about your overall service, your overall experience at the library, and we have a little bit more room in there for people to express their experience. Now, I've also seen in the chat some questions about providing the opportunity for people to say why, providing the opportunity for people to give more feedback than just these closed-ended items. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about that, because in a survey, you do have a number of different options for data collection, as Mallory explained. And when we choose a survey, we are primarily going to be using closed-ended items. And that's because what a survey does really great is to collect data from a whole bunch of people and then aggregate that data. So we want to have most of our questions being closed-ended, things like multiple choice, things like rating scales. It's always great to have a couple of open-ended items to provide an opportunity for folks to provide feedback in a more narrative form. But if we find ourselves with a survey that is just chock full of open-ended items, that's actually an indication that we might want to be using a different method. So when I find that I really want to hear people's opinions, I have a lot of questions about their perspectives, their experiences. If I start writing those out as survey items, that's actually a little flag for me to remember that I want to be thinking about interviews or focus groups in those cases. If I really want to know someone's, kind of get that rich qualitative data, that's an indication that we've got a different method that we should be thinking about. When we're using surveys, we want most of those items to be closed-ended. And then the final thing in terms of writing quality items is that writing them is like step 1 of the process, right? Is like sitting here alone in my computer, I'm going to write them, I'm going to revise them, I'm going to reorder them. And then I'm going to go through a process of bringing in other people to help review and test those items. And so I think about that in 3 steps. So the first is asking a colleague to review my items. So just like we did today, right? I just put them out there for all of you. And as a group, we came up with a whole bunch of flaws, right? And so we got to have a little bit of a thick skin, take it to our colleagues, ask for their opinions. And in my experience, they always get better when we do that. People always see things that we missed the first time. So that's step 1. Step 2 then is to actually test these items with members of the public or whoever you are trying to gather data from. We want to test these with people that match that group as closely as possible. And we do that through a process called think aloud testing or cognitive interviewing, where you have folks take a sample survey or a set of the questions you want to ask and talk out loud and share kind of what's going through their mind and how they're interpreting the items. That's a really important step for revising them. And we're going to share some resources at the end about how we do that. And then the third is that we also want to do pilot testing. We want to administer the survey to a small group of people so that we can see what the data look like coming in, and both in terms of testing the technology and fixing that on the back end, but also testing the actual answers that we're getting to make sure that we're getting what we expect. So taken together, these steps should help us to get some quality items put together in our survey. And then our next step is going to be moving toward administering that survey. And I'm going to hand it back to Mallory to tell us about that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so once you have those quality survey items developed, you've fixed any of those flaws that we just gave examples of, the next thing you want to consider thoughtfully is how you're going to actually administer the survey. And so the first piece of that is, of course, defining your audience. So, the best survey items in the world don't mean a thing if you're asking them of the wrong people, right? And so the purpose of, I listed some things on the screen here to consider when you're defining your audience. And the very first one that I have there is alignment with the defined purpose of your survey. So that thing we talked about back in the first step, think about your why. You're going to want to return to that, right? It'll help you think about who is it that you're wanting to hear from. So are you wanting to hear from known program participants only because you want to hear what their experience was like? Or maybe pardon me, maybe you are wanting to know a little bit more about what might be preventing certain folks in the community from attending programs, in which case your audience is going to be different, right? So you're going to maybe do a survey that goes out to all of your cardholders or to your community more broadly, that it's made available to all of them. So really thinking about how your audience aligns with how you're planning to use the survey results. Some additional things that you might want to consider if you have the capability to kind of filter by these different parameters when you're doing your survey send or sharing it might be things like behavioral parameters. So maybe you only want to hear from cardholders who have been active in the last 2 years, or only patrons that you know have attended a program within the last year. Another thing might be demographics. So maybe you're just interested in hearing from those adult program participants. So you're wanting to survey folks that are 18 plus, or maybe what you're really focused on are programs or services for older adults, right? So maybe you only want to be sending the survey to folks that are age 65 and above. There might also be something related to geography or place of residence. So there might be some reason that you're wanting to just hear from patrons that are from particular zip codes, again, if that's information that you have. And then the final bullet point that I have listed on this slide here that you want to think about is the quantity and diversity of respondents that you'd like to hear from. So how many people are you wanting to hear from in this survey in order for you to feel comfortable using what you learned to make some decisions? And then if you're asking me demographic questions, how diverse do you want that respondent pool to look? So, as much as I would love to give a clear-cut answer to this one, and it's such a common thing that comes up, and I totally get it when people are like, well, what's the magic number? Like, how many people do I need to hear from? The reality is that there's not like a hard and fast rule that I'm going to give in this instance. For much of the survey work that you'll be doing in the context of library programs and outreach you're going to have some flexibility to determine what's the minimum number of people that you want to hear from, based on what your purpose of the survey is, based on what you know about your audience and your community. For the most part, the data collection that you're going to be doing in this context is going to be to help you with program planning, to help you with program improvement, not for the purpose of this like really strict survey research where you're looking for statistical significance and you're wanting to get results that are generalizable. If you were, let's say, wanting to get some information from the community broadly in order for the library to make some kind of high level decisions about operations or about finances or things like that, that would be an instance where you'd want to be a little bit more rigorous. And it would probably behoove your library to work with an expert in survey research to kind of lead that process. So they can do all of the things that you would need to do to ensure that you're getting that big representative sample of your community. And then in terms of sample diversity, this, like I said, is only a consideration if you're asking demographic questions, things like age, race, ethnicity, gender. If you aren't already incorporating those type of questions into your data collection, it might be something that you want to consider. You can make those types of questions optional so that it's totally voluntary for someone to give that information. But sometimes when you get that, it could give you some insights into if and how experiences with satisfaction with the library services might differ across different demographic groups. So just something to consider there. And then the next thing after you have your audience defined, you want to determine what format is best for your purpose and your audience. So this is the question of, do you want it to be online only? Do you want it to be paper only? Do you want it to be a combination? This is, like many things, going to be driven by who your audience is, right? So let's say, for example, if you're wanting to hear mainly from older adults, perhaps based on what you know of your older adult patrons, that they would prefer to have something paper-based. So maybe you're going to lean on paper-based a lot more for that particular survey that you're doing. What I most often recommend is doing a combination approach. So having an online survey be the primary format that you're using, and then just have a paper option available for folks that works better for them to respond that way. And then what you'd want to do if you did have this kind of combination approach, if any of those paper-based things that you get back, is have a staff member go in and actually enter that into the online survey so that all those data live in the same place when it comes time for analysis, which we'll talk more about later. And then if you are using an online approach, you have to decide what specific platform you're going to use. So there are lots of options out there available for you to use for surveys. Not all of them free, and with varying degrees of sophistication in terms of like question format and skip logic and other functionality. Some of the ones that what I've really used most frequently in my work in general and my work with libraries has been Google Forms. It's a pretty solid, basic, free, importantly, option that isn't perfect, but it gets better and better every year. It's also nice, which I'll reference a little bit later too, if you are Google-based as a library, because there's other tools that integrate pretty seamlessly with the Google Forms in terms of analysis, like with Google Sheets, and then with some data visualization later as well. I've also used Alchemer and SurveyMonkey before, both of which have free options that come with some limitations on like the number of questions per survey, the number of respondents per survey. But then there are also paid options that are a little bit more robust. And I've particularly liked Alchemer when I've used that in the past too. So just a few of the many options that are available for online surveys. And then we've also listed down there at the bottom some other considerations when you're thinking about your format. So the first one we have there is language and literacy. And that's something that, of course, you should be thinking about at earlier stages of your survey development too, but something that you really need to get clear about before you're going to launch the actual survey. So in terms of literacy, there are lots of free tools online for you to check readability in terms of grade level, if that's something that's important for you from a kind of an accessibility standpoint. You just Google how to check reading level of text, and there's a bunch of things that pop up. I don't believe that there's a built-in readability testing feature on Google Docs, but Microsoft Word definitely has one. So you could build your survey content in Google Docs and then copy it over into one of those online testers, or build it in Microsoft Word and then test it there before you actually start building the survey in the platform that you chose. And then you also want to consider whether or not you need to make it available in a language other than English based on your audience or your community. And if the answer is yes to this question, I am by no means an expert on translation services or doing multilingual work with surveys. So would recommend connecting with an expert that has a lot of experience in that, because I know there's a lot of steps that go into that process in order for you to end up with a quality product at the end. But just some things for you to consider in terms of not creating any barriers for people in your community to be able to give that feedback. Another thing is accessibility and assistance. So in addition to that question about whether or not you're going to be online or paper-based, you also want to think about if and how you'll provide support to patrons in completing those surveys if they need assistance. And so that could be related to things like language and literacy, or it could be things like limited vision or other sensory processing issues. So just as an example, when I had previously been on staff at the Oak Park Public Library as their manager of data analytics before I moved into doing consulting work full time. And when I was still there, I remember there was a time where we had a program participant that participated in one of our virtual offerings. And this person had limited vision and wanted to be able to give feedback on the program survey, but couldn't just like sit down with that Google form and fill it out on the computer, or maybe even with a piece of paper if we would have been able to give that to them. And so what we ended up doing in that instance was I connected with that person. We set up a time to talk on the phone. And then I read through those survey questions and took down, like I typed in, filled out the survey with what they were sharing as they were sharing it with me. And we got really great feedback from this person, and it's feedback we otherwise wouldn't have gotten if we hadn't made a plan for how we were going to provide that extra support if it was needed. So just wanted to share that as a plug for thinking about some of those pieces that you might not think about until they come up. And then the last piece being anonymity. So deciding whether or not you need or want to collect any identifying or contact information from the folks who are filling out your survey. So one approach that can be taken, and we've done that at Oak Park, I know in the past, is to have the survey be anonymous by default, but then you could have a question at the very end that's like, if you explicitly want to be contacted afterwards to talk about anything you shared, or if you're just open to being contacted afterward, here's a space for you to give your name and your phone number or email or however you want to be contacted. So that's one way that you could approach it. So then you're almost ready to launch now. Just a couple of final pieces to take care of. The first being developing introductory language. So you want to make sure that you have some language that's either embedded in the survey itself in an introduction, or it's in the message, like, if you send the survey out via email, that really clearly and succinctly explains what the purpose of the survey is and what you're planning to do with the data. So I would include here a note about anonymity or confidentiality in it. And you might also consider adding like an email address that they could reach out to if they had any questions or concerns after filling out the survey. And then the second piece being planning how you'll actually share the survey with respondents. So are you going to send it out via email in like a library newsletter, text message? You're going to post it in a social media post? If you do paper-based surveys, are you going to have kind of like a station that you set up in one of your library buildings or all of your library buildings? If you have multiple, where folks could go and fill out the paper-based survey and drop it in a box or give it to a staff member. And so then once you've decided these last pieces, you're ready to launch, you can get things going, all that great data starts to come in. And then once you close the survey, and you have to decide how long you're going to keep it open, you're ready to do some analysis. So Rebecca's going to talk about that next.
Great. Thanks, Mallory. Yeah, so you've got all these data, and now our next step is analysis. And so in order to really make a plan for analysis and have the right resources in place and the right process in place, the first thing that we're going to want to do is identify those data, is sort of sort them into different buckets based on the data type that we have. And typically in surveys that we use in libraries, we have three kinds of data. We have numerical data, we have categorical data, and we have qualitative data. So I'm going to talk about what each of those are and then how we go about analyzing them. So first up are the numerical data, and these are actual numbers. So these are things that these are things like number of people, the number of minutes or days or hours that something took place, people's ages in actual years, Numerical data are data that show up as numbers, and as such, the way that we analyze them is using an actual like mathematical process, use arithmetic to analyze them. So when we get a data set that's numerical, the first thing we often want to know is how much do they vary? It's really helpful to get a sense overall of how spread out these numbers are. And in order to do that analysis, we use something called a range, which is where we look at the space between the highest and the lowest values. Then we often want to know where the center of that data set is. And so we might want to take a mean, which is similar to it is an average, or use the median, which is finding the middle. I'm going to show you what each of those are and why you might want to use them. But I want to be really clear that the software that you're using that Mallory just shared, things like Alchemer, SurveyMonkey, Excel, have these features built in. So you don't have to know how to do them. You just have to know which one you want to use and why. So I'm going to use a non-survey example to show you this because it's going to make the point more clear, and then we can kind of transfer this over. This would be an example of numerical data. We have a series of programs and we counted up how many people are there, and there they are. We have our list of attendance figures. So we might want to use a range here to be able to indicate how spread out these are, that we had one program that had 12 people, but we had another one that had 154. And that means we had a range of 142 attendees. This is super helpful to actually give someone a sense of the variety that we're dealing with in our data. Now, we often take an average, right? We use an arithmetic mean when we're analyzing these kind of data. And to do that, what we do is we add it all up. We get the total attendance, which in this case is 351. We divide by the number of programs. There were 9 of them. And then we get a mean of 39. So a lot of the times, that's a great way to analyze these data. But if we look at this particular list, we have that outlier there, right? We have that program that had 154 people. And so what happens is, in this case, is that our mean of 39 is actually like really at the high end of what happened. So it's way down there between our 38 and our 154. And it's actually not the center. It doesn't really give a good sense of the center of these data. And so that's where the median comes in. The median is the actual middle value. So we listed out those numbers in order and we just counted into the middle, and that's where 26 was. So if someone reports these and says, you know, the mean was 39, the median was 26, people who live and breathe data will know that that means you had some outliers in your data. And so it's really important to do that. If you only present that mean, it's going to, in this case, kind of inflate the attendance of all those other programs because you have that one outlier. So, so these are the 3 ways of analyzing most of our numerical data that we're going to be using. Now, we also often have categorical data. And this means that we have categories, that when people were given response choices, they were choosing among categories. This can get a little confusing because sometimes the categories are numbers, right? So we saw earlier we had a choice of age ranges, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, that sort of thing. But those are in fact categories, and so we want to analyze them as such. We also have categorical data when we have things like rating scales that are like levels of satisfaction, degree of interest, frequency, how often do you come to the library? Those kinds of things are going to be categorical data. And so when we analyze categorical data, the way we do that is that first, we typically want to know what are the most common responses? What did people choose most often? And the way we do that is with something called a frequency distribution, which I'll show you in a minute. And it's often important to think about how responsive varied for different groups of people. This gets back to what Mallory was saying about the importance of collecting demographic data, because that allows us to disaggregate the data. And that can be really important to see what differences there are for people that are within that group. And I'll give you an example. So we can see on the screen a frequency distribution that shows the amount of people that strongly disagreed, agreed, or strongly agreed with our survey item. We can see here that there were 238 responses, and then we have those percentages that fell into those different categories. And so this tells us that agree was the strongest response. We also had a pretty, quarter of the people disagree. That's important to know. We've got about 20% there that strongly agreed, etc. We then want to go ahead and disaggregate the data based on some of those demographic variables that are important for the decision we're trying to make. And so these are the same data, but now I've pulled them apart by age group. And so we can see that we had 22 teens that were in that data set. And actually 91% of them strongly agreed, right? The adults are over there, 216, they fit that pattern we saw earlier. And so this is really important. The reason that we disaggregate is that if we have a smaller group, a smaller subset of people within a larger data set, they can be sort of clouded over by the overall responses. So you lose when you don't pull them apart and disaggregating them, those smaller voices get covered over by the larger group. So it's really important to divide out our data, to disaggregate our data so that we can see those variations. And then finally, we often have some qualitative data. Those are the responses to our open-ended items, and they are in the form of words rather than numbers or categories. And so analyzing qualitative data means that we are looking to see what ideas were expressed. And we do that by coding them into different categories, which I'll show you. And then we often, once we have those categories, we often want to know, again, what ideas were most common. And we'll go back to a good old frequency distribution, but this time it's a distribution of those categories. So for example, we might have an open-ended question that asks what people found most valuable about a program. So we're going to read through all those comments, and we're going to group the ones that are talking about a similar idea. So here we have examples. Someone said, it's great to learn how to do a new skill. I liked trying to do it as she was demonstrating. I loved having a completed project to take home. I pulled those all together and I said that they were all falling in with a category of a hands-on activity, that what people liked the most was this, the hands-on activity that was part of the program. And then you can see, no, you can't. There we go. You can see our frequency distribution. Then we're going to list all our categories and our responses. So hands-on activity came in, about a third of the people said that, but other people found it valuable that the program was fun or relaxing, that they connected with others, or that it gave them ideas for future projects. So that's how we work with qualitative data. So to wrap up about analysis, we wanted to share 3 missteps that are pretty common and that we want to help you be sure to avoid. So the first is sometimes you'll read someone's report and you'll see that they have calculated a mean or an average for categorical data, such as rating scales. So it's important to remember that categorical data aren't really numbers. They aren't actual numbers. They are categories. And so we always want to analyze those based on a frequency distribution rather than trying to do math with categories. Second is that when we're analyzing those qualitative data, it can be tempting to just lump a whole bunch of them together into a category called other. And sometimes it's also the way the data come in, right? If we have an other category, but we want to be sure that our other is, whenever possible, is our smallest category when we analyze our data. So we should, to the best of our ability, end up with a very small amount in that category. And then the third is just a reminder that as we're working with these data, not to forget that they are only representative of the people who responded to our survey. It's really tempting to start saying things like, 90% of our community thinks blah, 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 but it's actually 90% of our survey respondents who think that. And so we just need to take care that we don't overextend what we know and generalize to people who did not take our survey. So that naturally takes us into our fifth area, which is sharing what you learned. And so I'm going to hand that back to Mallory.
Great. Yeah, so this is our fifth and final step thing to consider is sharing what you learn. So I mentioned this earlier. You ultimately want to make sure you're actually using the data, right? And sharing it with the people that need to see it. One of the worst things that can happen is you've spent all this time, all this brain power designing, collecting, analyzing your survey data, and then it just sits on a physical or a virtual shelf somewhere and nobody talks about it. So we want to talk about sharing your data story. And you can go to the next slide for that one. So like with the survey, the actual survey itself, the first thing you want to think about is your audience. And you could have multiple different audiences. They might be internal, like maybe you're sharing it just with your programming team at your library, and maybe you're sharing it with library staff broadly, maybe with your board. Or they could be external. So it could be, sharing it with the community at large, sharing it with your cardholder population, maybe with library peers, existing or potential funders, or even just kind of closing the loop and sharing it back with those respondents that you shared the survey with to say, hey, this is who we heard from and what you all were telling us. So once you've decided what your audience or your audiences are, then you can kind of pick the best format for sharing your data and the insights that you glean from it. And it will probably be more than one format, especially if you have more than one audience. So, for example, you might have like a more detailed summary report. That's the kind of thing that you would share with your programming team, or maybe you'd share with leadership at your library, maybe even with your board. But then maybe you have kind of a condensed sort of executive summary style one pager or an infographic that just gives the highlights, and that's the kind of thing that you would share back with the respondents who filled it out or with your community broadly. And then another format, it's the last one that I have listed on the slide here that can be really useful and engaging, is a data dashboard. So that's something that I've used a lot in the work that I've done with the Oak Park Public Library, and these can be static or they can be live and interactive, again, depending on kind of what your needs are and who your audience is. And there's multiple tools that you can use to develop these. So there are a couple of Microsoft products. You can make static dashboards in Excel. You can also use Power BI, which is another Microsoft product. Tableau is another one that I've used before to make dashboards. But what I've really used the most in my experience making dashboards is Looker Studio, which was previously called Google Data Studio. It's a free app that's in the Google Suite. So if you have a Google account, you automatically have access to this. So just to give you an example of what that could look like, the slide that you're seeing right now is a screenshot of part of one of the dashboards that I made for Oak Park. It's the adult program survey results. So the feedback itself is collected through a Google form. So this goes back to that thing I mentioned earlier about certain things kind of speaking to each other in a streamlined way. So those surveys are a Google form. The results from that Google form automatically populate a Google Sheet, and that Google Sheet is what's talking to this Looker Studio. And so what makes that useful is that means that this dashboard is updating in real time every time there's a new survey that gets submitted. So you can decide how you want to display all of your data in here with different charts and tables and graphs. You can also add filters to it. So those three black boxes that are in the top right that you see are a filter by month, by year, and by program names. You could filter by one or more of those if you just want to see a subset of the data, since this is defaulting to show all of the data that's been collected. And then I mentioned this is just part of that dashboard. There's a second page. There's a little bit more on the first page that didn't make the screenshot. And then there's a second page that has a table that's also filterable that has all of that open-ended feedback. So any of the comments that were in the survey, so folks could peruse that as well. So this dashboard isn't one that's made publicly available. It's really for internal sharing among staff. So it's posted on the staff intranet, and anyone can go look at it. And if they want to check out what surveys look like for programs that they facilitated, they have the ability to do that. There are, if you want to see some other examples of what dashboards made in Looker Studio can look like, there are a couple of other examples on Oak Park's website. There's an evaluating our impact page that has a couple embedded there, one about community satisfaction and one about core stats. So things like circulation and Wi-Fi use and program attendance. So just sharing that if you wanted, if this is the first time you're hearing of Looker Studio, because I found that that's all often the case for people. If you're wanting to see examples of what that can look like, that's a place you can check out. So that wraps up the content in our 5 key things to consider, but we did have some resources we wanted to share, and I think the first couple slides are yours, Rebecca, right?
Yes. Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, we wanted to share some of our favorite resources to kind of dig deeper into the different aspects of what we've been talking about that might be relevant for you and your library. So these are 2 of my favorite books for creating surveys. The first one, Internet, Phone, Mail, and Mixed Mode Surveys by Dillman and colleagues, is it's in its 4th edition now. It's great. And you can dig into a lot of the different topics that we talked about. There's a chapter on administration. There's a chapter on, making scales, on testing, all that good stuff. And then Robinson and Leonard just came out fairly recently with this designing quality survey questions as explicitly about the survey items themselves. And it's, I find it written in like pretty normal language, like it's written for regular people, and it's quite accessible. And I really like that book a lot. The other 2 things I wanted to share are, I've been involved for the last few years in a project called Embedding Evaluation in Libraries, which was an IMLS funded project with Khalifa and Linda Hoffshire, a colleague that some of you probably know from Ripple. And so we have created a library of videos that go through a whole bunch of different topics about evaluation and data in libraries, and they're all really short, like 5-minute videos. And so I popped a link in here because we have 6 videos that relate to surveys, survey design, survey analysis, and those are all freely available, and you're welcome to dig those out. There's also other resources there. And then this Willis book on cognitive interviewing is has the instructions for how you do that testing where you have people think out loud. So that can be helpful as well.
Great. And then this slide and the next one too are ones that I popped in that are really related to that last step we talked about sharing your data story. So listed on this slide, just some of the dashboard and report development tools that I've used in the past. Like I said, I'm sure that there are others that might be of interest too, but Looker Studio, I gave 2 links there. One that's just an overview of that tool, and I believe there's a section in that overview where they give some additional examples too of what dashboards can look like. And then that second one is the link to the Google support page that is like, here's an introduction to Looker Studio. I linked there to Microsoft Power BI. Didn't include a link to Excel since I think we're all familiar with where Excel lives on our computers, but did put a note in there to see Depict Data Studio, which I'll mention on the next slide, for training resources around using Excel for making dashboards and reports. And then also linked to Tableau there. The first link is to the products that are available. They have, most of them are paid. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think they're a little bit on the pricey side, but they do have this tool that I think it's called now Tableau Public. That is one that you can access for free. And then that second link there is some of their training tutorials that they have available for free on their website. And then just listed Canva there on the end. That's like my go-to for reports and infographics and one-pagers and stuff like that. And then the last resources slide is, if we click to that one, yeah, it is just some data viz and storytelling resources. So these are just some folks, there are like a lot of people that are doing data viz work, but these are 3 that I have used a lot. So Depict Data Studio, that's Anne Emery. That's one that she does everything in Excel. So that's a really useful tool. There are some free resources on the blog that she has there, but then there are also actual courses that you could take that do have a fee. Stephanie Evergreen with Evergreen Data, I put a picture of, I believe that's the most recent edition of her Effective Data Visualization book. And then storytelling with data, also listed a book there to the right and links to that webpage as well. So these are going to be folks that in particular are helping you with some of those principles around like good data visualization. And I think that Anne Emery in particular is helpful because she's so focused on Excel, which is a really accessible tool for a lot of folks, and ways that you can use something that you know you already have, you don't have to pay extra money for, to make some really good reports and dashboards. And that wraps up resources. So I think we timed this very well, Rebecca. It's 3:01.
Yeah, we're
So
happy to answer questions. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
if anyone has questions, go ahead and throw them in the Q&A. We do have 3 to start off with. Hi, I'm Simon. I'm from Laconia, everybody. The first question is, if you want to parse for particular parameters, behavioral, demographic, etc., should you collect a broad data set and then isolate responses, or isolate responders based on fitting the parameters?
yeah, I think that it could be either, and Rebecca, you can jump in on this one too. I think it could be either one. So I think the piece around, if you're wanting to get information from a larger community, but then you want to be able to disaggregate, like Rebecca was talking about, to see like, are there differences when you look at certain demographic groups or things like that, you could go that route where you don't kind of limit yourself when you're getting respondents. But if you have an idea that like, I'm wanting to collect feedback about this very specific thing, and you have the ability to be able to say like, okay, we're going to do this survey send, and we're just going to send it to folks who are older adults, or we're just going to send it to folks that we know have gone to programs. I think that's something you should go ahead and take advantage of, because then you're not going to be getting in a bunch of feedback that maybe isn't from the people that you were really needing to hear from in the first place. Would you add anything to that, Rebecca?
No, I completely agree. I feel like there's this temptation, like, wouldn't it be nice to know? Like, we'll just get it from everyone, but we can end up drowning in data that way. And so being really consistent with our purpose, I think, is really great advice. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Next question is, has anyone tried a checkout receipt survey like many fast food restaurants use?
Mm.
I haven't personally had experience with that. Have you, Rebecca?
No, I haven't. The closest I've seen, which is not super close, is like a postcard, sending people away
Yeah.
with a little postcard survey that has a few questions to return, like leaving a box at the end or something. But yeah, I don't know about the checkout surveys or the receipts.
Yeah. And I know one thing that I've seen is like a new cardholder survey too. So if you have something set up where it's like, maybe you have a set of emails that goes out to after someone signs up and they're a brand new cardholder, and you know that like over the course of the next 2 months or whatever, you have certain kind of welcome to your library, orientation to your library emails that are going out, that in one of those early ones you could send a survey to be like, how are you anticipating using in your library, or things like that. But yeah, I haven't had any experience with those checkout receipts. It's an interesting idea.
Right. And the final question is, why not calculate means for rating scales data? Is it still a misstep if you have a large data set? Thanks.
Great question. And that reminds me too that I flagged the question about midpoints on a rating scale, so we'll come back to that too. Okay, the reason not to calculate a mean, there's 2 parts. So the first part is that some categorical data that would require like assigning an artificial value. Like if you have age ranges and your category 1 is like 0 to 4, 5 to 9, like which number would you pick in order to condense it and be able to calculate an average, right? If that makes sense. And so there's like a whole set of categorical data that are just like, there's not like a logical way to convert them into numbers that then you could do math on. Often this question comes up about the other kind, which is if you have like a 1 to 5 rating scale, and it's like extremely satisfied, very sad, those kind of things, like why not just go ahead and average them? And the truth is I will not tell on you if you do it. Sometimes we all do it, because it's quick, it's easy, and it's like intuitively makes sense. But the reason that it's actually, the problem with it is that if you're averaging something, if you're doing math on it, you're assuming that the underlying assumption of numerical values is that there's even spacing between the values. So like, in real numbers, the difference between 10 years and 11 years and 12 years, each of those are actually 1 year increments. But the difference between very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, a little bit satisfied are not evenly, we don't really know. There's people who study this, and they aren't actually evenly spread. And so what happens is we actually don't know what's closer or what's farther apart. And so we have to keep it at the categorical level. That being said, to be like super honest with you, if you, for the purposes that you are using the data, it's probably just fine. I feel like when I'm wearing my professor hat, I have to say like, don't do this, that's wrong. But when I'm wearing my like, let's be real hat, like probably everything's going to be just fine. What do you think about that, Mallory?
No, I completely agree, because I can point to things that I know I've made in the past where it hasn't been like a not at all, somewhat very. It's just been a rated on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is the lowest and 5 is the best. And have presented that as like, it was 4.2 was the average, because of that piece of when you're thinking about your audience and who's getting the information. I think you said this earlier, that it's like very readily understood of what that means, where it's like, oh, okay, so if 10 was best and you're saying that like the average was like 9.7, so there were a lot of 9s and 10s that came through in that. So I completely agree with that yeah, the professor hat versus the, not that I'm a professor, but that versus the like just being real about what maybe is readily understood by folks. Yeah.
Right. That's all we have for questions. Everyone's being very complimentary in the chat. Thank you for such a great presentation. I'm going to hand it back over to Caitlin to wrap it up.
Great. Thank you, Simon. And thank you, Rebecca and Mallory, for taking the time to present today's program for us. We greatly appreciate it. It was very informational. And I wanted to also thank everyone, attendees, for joining us today. As we did mention at the beginning, this program was recorded, so we will share that with all of you in the next day or so, along with the slides from this presentation. And we will also be sending out a post-evaluation survey, so please check your email to fill it out. We do greatly appreciate your feedback. So thank you, everyone, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.